set to start a couple of hours from now in Washington between both Lebanese and Israeli diplomats. To talk more about this, we can welcome Filippo Dionigi, who's a senior lecturer of politics and international relations at the University of Bristol. Thanks for joining us today, Filippo. Israel then ruling out any discussion of a ceasefire with Hezbollah, again calling for disarmament of the group, as we just heard. Hezbollah itself saying the talks should be scrapped because they are, quote, futile. It has to be said, expectations going into these diplomatic conversations later today are pretty low.
Yes, that is correct. This was already looking since the beginning a very uphill process. The only actor in this that is possibly most interested in achieving an outcome through this process is the Lebanese government and the Lebanese institutions, which, listening to the people of Lebanon, are looking for a cessation of hostilities as soon as possible. And in order to try to obtain that objective, what they offered is the beginning of a possible process of peace negotiations with Israel. So we should be clear about this. The Lebanese authorities have not committed to a normalization right now. What they asked for now is a ceasefire. And then on the basis of a lasting ceasefire, then they have declared that in principle they will be available to appoint a committee of members that then may be tasked with negotiating a potential normalization of relations between Israel and Lebanon. But as things stand down, go on.
No, I was going to say that they'd asked for a ceasefire even before, heading to Washington to engage in these talks. Obviously, that wasn't, that hasn't gone into effect at all. The fact that expectations are low, this is all a shaky ceasefire between the US and Iran is kind of very much linked to this. How much pressure can we imagine the United States is likely to put on both Israel and Lebanon, because this could ultimately derail those talks between the US and Iran, of which there may or may not be a second round?
Exactly. So what we witnessed in the past few days is that the US and Israeli policies that of trying to sort of decouple the two fronts, the Iranian fronts and the Lebanese fronts to an extent. We saw this most obviously on April the 8th when Israel has effectively launched a devastating attack against Lebanon at the very moment in which the ceasefire was announced with Iran, meaning that there is no entire. There is the two fronts are perceived as different between by the U.S. and Israel, and then trying to separate these two fronts. But there is also a misalignment probably between the U.S. and Israel in this respect. The U.S. is certainly trying to put an end to the conflict with Iran, but it doesn't look like it's equally committed to the end of the conflict with Lebanon, meaning that some of the expectations for a positive outcome of these negotiations between Lebanon and Israel count on the fact that the US may put pressure on Israel to accept the condition of a ceasefire, to then start with peace negotiations. But in reality, we're not entirely sure whether the US is entirely committed to the idea that Israel should end its operations in Lebanon at this point, therefore making these negotiations even less credible. After all, let us consider the fact that Israel had already committed to a ceasefire in October 2024, and it did regularly violate that ceasefire. And the United States, which was basically the main broker of that process, really never intervened in that respect to uphold the rules of that ceasefire.
I mean, as you say, this has always been a very complex situation. I mean, Hezbollah created in the 1980s because of Israel's occupation, or as an answer to Israel's occupation of Lebanon in the Lebanese civil war. I mean, the fact that the conflict between these two countries, or certainly between Israel and Hezbollah, is so deeply embedded adds another dimension to just how complex renewing diplomatic relations is going to be.
Well, yes. I mean, this has been a long-lasting conflict. The Arab-Israeli conflict is a very long-lasting conflict that doesn't look like it has, any short-term solution at hand at this moment, right? So it is deeply ingrained in the politics of Lebanon. The very existence of Hezbollah as an entity is based on the fact that there is a perception of insecurity determined by Israeli attacks on Lebanon, right? So Hezbollah will continue to maintain its stance of resistance movement as long as Israel will continue to represent a possible threat to the security, especially of the Shia community that Hezbollah purports to represent in Lebanese politics at that point. And this cycle will continue. Even yesterday, we heard the Hezbollah Secretary General in one of his speeches basically saying that it does not acknowledge these negotiations, and it has actually addressed the government and asked them to effectively withdraw from these negotiations.
Filippo, I'd like to think a little bit about Hezbollah as a group. I mean, if you look at the responses to the group in Lebanon, you have on one side Hezbollah's supporters that say their group is the only protection against Israel, that they see as an enemy wanting to take Lebanese land. If you look to those who are opposed to Hezbollah, they say that Hezbollah's real boss is ultimately Iran, who was trained, who was financed, and Iran embroiled them into, or Lebanon, I should say, into a war that it doesn't want to, or wars that it doesn't want to be involved in. It's a group on the ground that provokes divergent responses. What does Hezbollah represent?
Well, Hezbollah has been an entity, as you were saying a few minutes ago, that has its origins from the 1982 invasion of Israel, that then continued up until 2000 with the occupation of South Lebanon. And then from there has basically derived its legitimacy in the public opinion of Lebanon as a resistance movement as such, and keeps having this role every time that Israel attacks Lebanon, especially given the fact that Lebanese institutions are particularly weak and incapable of effectively replacing the type of response that Hezbollah is giving to Israel's attacks to Lebanon at that point, right? So as long as this cycle of insecurity feeds itself, Hezbollah will claim to have a resistance role within Lebanon, and at least part of Lebanese population will think that that legitimacy is, in fact, based on correct assumptions, and therefore that process will continue. Now, one way possibly to break this process might be, to sort of try to agree first and foremost on a national stance among all sects of Lebanon, including the Shia community and including also Hezbollah. And then on the basis of that agreement, then move on with a possible step towards a process of normalization of relations with Israel. At the end, there is no alternative. Lebanon and Israel and any other states in the region will have to find a way of coexistence through peace in the medium to long term. The problem is that for now, instead, weapons are those that are deciding the political process, and there doesn't seem to be much room for diplomatic negotiations. Sadly so, because as you were saying, as your reporters were saying, the situation in Lebanon is disastrous. There are 1.2 million displaced, the economic situation is serious, and the infrastructural damage that this war is causing is also devastating.
I'd like to think a little bit about the role of the Lebanese government, Filippo, because on the one hand, you have Joseph Ayoun, who seemed to be for the disarmament of Hezbollah, but we know that the Lebanese military is in a weakened position. We know that the government perhaps doesn't have as much leverage, as much influence as it might. Ayoun initially spoke about options that might be on the table when it comes to Hezbollah, this idea that Hezbollah would, move its fighters and weapons from southern Lebanon. What do you think are the options currently, given the state of the Lebanese government and the fact that it is weakened?
Well, there were certain options available before the beginning of this conflict, and there are other options, perhaps, that will emerge as an outcome of this conflict when we will have a clearer image and clearer information about the actual capacity of Hezbollah, which again also now is demonstrated to be anyway stronger than we thought how it was at the time of the 2024 ceasefire. So we will have to see. The reality is one important fact is anyway that the Shia community of Lebanon represents at least 1/3 of its population, and therefore they should be entitled and they should have a role within the political system of Lebanon that acknowledge that proportion within the demographics of Lebanon, right? That is to an extent acknowledged with the fact that the Shia will always have the chair of the parliament as the office in what is the power sharing agreement of Lebanon. But in the longer term perspective, it might be needed a deeper constitutional rethinking of Lebanese power sharing structures so that then progressively perhaps Hezbollah and its military capacity can be integrated within the Lebanese army. This is one of the ideas that has been proposed at some point in the past years. And then at that point will become part and parcel of Lebanese sovereignty rather than being an alternative to it and rather than undermining the credibility of Lebanese institutions as such.
All right, Filippo, so much more to ask you. I'm afraid that we are out of time. You're a senior lecturer of politics and